We mentioned Val and his recovery. We're thankful he's done so well and want him to continue that recovery. We'll continue to pray for him. Richard Harvey Sr., we mentioned him being diagnosed with cancer, of course. And as he has doctor's appointments, let's remember him in our prayers. Ginger Swearingen had foot surgery and is recovering from that. Still not able to put weight, I think, on that foot just yet. We mentioned Wednesday night Carlene Elliott having a fall. They'd moved her. She was at Mayo, moved her across over to Cypress Village, but she's not doing well. And they called hospice in, I think, on Friday maybe. So just remember her in your prayers and her family. Lillian Ridley, who had a fall a few weeks back, recovering at Jacksonville Rehab there on Dunn. Star Collier, who also had a fall and had broken her ankle foot. She's at Lakeside Rehab there on Dunn Avenue. We mentioned, of course, Natalie and having some tests that were scheduled, and she'll be having those. So remember her in our prayers. Audrey's son, Kenneth Blackwelder, who's now at Green Coast Springs Rehab, right? He's in rehab there, okay. So let's remember him as he's there and again, still trying to recover from COVID. My sister mentioned she'll be going through chemotherapy. I think that'll start the 1st of November. Should be about 4 months worth of that. If you would remember her in your prayers. And then last Sunday, I think it was, Mandy Martinez mentioned she was going to be traveling to Mexico, so she was going to be gone, going to be there visiting family. John would be here, and so make sure John is well fed and taken care of and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to order a pizza and send it to his house or something. Good. Her friends that she mentioned? Okay. Yes, she had mentioned a couple friends as well with some health issues, so that's good to hear. So let's remember all those in our prayer. And then also we mentioned just the other night Marina's father, Eugene, who is suffering from COVID. So let's remember him in our prayers as well. And then we have some friends of ours. Will actually plays baseball with, but anyway, the mother, her father they found this past week a brain tumor. They actually did surgery, I think, Friday and was able to remove it, but they think it was cancer. They think there's probably cancer somewhere else, so they're running tests on him. But his name is Johnny Watkins, if you would remember him in your prayers. And then there was a few, and I don't know how many of you might remember these individuals, but there were a couple, I think, of former members here who passed away recently. Kay Sasser was one, so if you know Kay Sasser or that family, but keep that family in your prayers. I think her... Yeah. And by the way, that's a timeless thing. You can talk to people today who may have trouble in their relationship because of in-laws or something along those lines. But David's family, and he's expected to be there. But David asked Jonathan, he said, look, I ought to be there, but I'm not going to be there. Okay? Let me go, let me hide myself in the field until the third evening. So I'm going to be gone for a few days. This feast likely would have gone on for several days. So it wasn't like it was just one meal where Saul would have been so busy that he might not have noticed that David wasn't there. He's going to notice that there's a seat that's going to be empty, and he's going to know exactly who that seat belongs to. So he says, verse 6, if your father misses me at all, in other words, if he says something about it, where's David? Why isn't David here? And again, how would Saul probably have acted in the presence of his son Jonathan? He probably would have said, oh, where's David? Oh, my son-in-law, where is he, right? I mean, he's going to probably come across as like he's genuinely kind of concerned about, oh, where is he at? Says, if your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says, verse 7, it is good, your servant will be safe. In other words, if he says, oh, okay, no big deal, okay? If that's what he says, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. In other words, Saul, if he really wants David dead, don't you think that Saul's probably been plotting and scheming something? He's cooking something up, some way, somehow, to be able to take David out or to have David taken out? So David realizes this, and he says, and you think about it, you have this plan, and you get there, and something happens at the very beginning that throws the whole thing off, or that is not going to be able to happen now because of that, right? And so what would that do? Well, if you had plans and you were really, hoping on something, it's probably going to make you pretty mad, pretty upset. And so he says, if your father is angry, if he's upset about this, right? I mean, because that's a very real possibility. In fact, that's what David predicts it's probably going to happen. Then know that he's decided on evil. In other words, there's your clue. There's your sign, Jonathan. If I'm not there, and your dad is very upset the fact that I'm not there, okay? It's because he wanted to do me harm, and now he's mad because it's not going to happen. And probably too that he knows that David knows, because whether or not Saul knew at this point that David knew, not 100% sure. You would think maybe he would, but maybe he didn't. But David's not being here at this particular feast as being a family member, then Saul would know. David's on to me. David knows. He knows how I feel. Okay? So he kind of comes up with this plan. Remember, Jonathan already told him, whatever you ask me to do, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. And so here he is. He comes up with this idea. And he says in verse 8, this is still David talking, "Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself, for why then should you bring me to your father?" So here is what he's saying. He's petitioning his friend Jonathan here. But notice the term that he uses. What does he call Jonathan, or what does he refer to Jonathan as? Or what does he refer to himself as in regards to Jonathan? Your servant. Now wait a second. David's already been told, hey, you're the next king. Why should David be anybody's servant if that's the case? Why would David look at himself in that way or mention himself in that regard? Right. It goes back to his heart, doesn't it? He was a man that was humble. Okay? He didn't think too highly of himself. He didn't say, well, God's already made me king, so Jonathan, you might want to stay in line on this one. You know what's best for you, right? He didn't do that. He refers to himself as a servant of Jonathan. So he asked Jonathan to deal kindly with him based upon the covenant that they had already made. So he reminds him of that covenant there. But notice what he says. If I've done something wrong, if there is iniquity in me, he says, put me to death yourself. For why then should you bring me to your father? In other words, if I've done wrong, and I really truly have done something that I should not have done, and it deserves the punishment of death, Jonathan, I'd rather it come from you and not from your father. Okay? And again, it just shows, I think, the depth of the friendship and the love between these two men who were had become like brothers. Well, they were, brother-in-laws, right? But they had become very, very close. And so David is entrusting Jonathan to do this. Now, they made a covenant, right? What if Jonathan went rogue, so to speak? What if Jonathan, after walking away from David, kind of had a smile on his face like, I'm not going to turn my back on my dad. Family, blood's thicker than water. Okay? So, yeah, who's to say that Jonathan wouldn't do that? But David trusted him, didn't he? As a friend, David was probably a pretty good judge of character. He'd kind of judged Saul's character rightly, hadn't he? And kind of figured that out. But I think he knew Jonathan well enough to know that if Jonathan and I made this covenant together, and it was before the Lord that we did this, then Jonathan's going to do what he says that he's going to do. And so his faith and his trust, that and obviously it's in God still, right? Overall. Because that's why David tells Jonathan, if I've done something wrong, then you kill me, right? Because David still understood there is a sense of right and wrong and justice, because he knew that God was greater than all. And so, David wanted to do right, but didn't want to have to do wrong. But if he did do wrong, then he knew that there would be a punishment for that, and he was willing to accept that punishment. So he had faith in God overall, obviously, but at this point he puts his faith in Jonathan because this is my opinion here, and I think the book kind of mentions this too, but because knowing Jonathan, their friendship and the kind of person he was, because he and Jonathan had made a covenant before the Lord, he knew Jonathan was serious about that. He knew that Jonathan loved and feared the Lord as well, and that Jonathan would keep that covenant. Because Jonathan looked at that and said, hey, if I made this covenant with you before the Lord, and no matter what personal family feelings I might have that might even tug at my heart, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do the right thing. And so David appeals to Jonathan and says, deal kindly with me, your servant, calling himself that, because of the covenant they had made. And so here's Jonathan's response, verse 9. Jonathan said, far be it from you, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? In other words, Jonathan's saying, David, listen, I would be honest with you. If my father says, if through all this, whatever I do, and Dad says he's done this to me or he's done that to me, I would let you know. I would tell you about that. I would say, look, my dad says that you've done this or you've done that. And so he's basically saying to him, I'd be honest with you. I'll be up front with you. I'm not going to hide it from you. And I'm not going to keep it from you just to make you to where you don't feel bad about something that maybe you did, that you just didn't know about. Verse 10, David says to Jonathan there, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan said to David, come and let us go out into the field. So both of them went out to the field. Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. So again, they've already had a covenant before God, but Jonathan here and with David, he's saying this as God is a witness to this. And obviously God is a witness to all that we do. But certainly if we say we're going to do something, the Bible talks about being men and women of our word. Jesus said, let your yes be yes, your no be no. We see that repeated, I think, again in James chapter 5. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. In other words, if you say you're going to do something, do it. So you're not going to do something, then don't do it. And so, that's true of whatever we do, but in part because God is a witness to all that. God sees all of that. And, He watches over everything. And so, again, as we think about that, it's important, the things that we say that we're going to do. And Solomon in Ecclesiastes talks a little bit about that too, about making vows before the Lord and the danger of not keeping those. But he says, when I have sounded, verse 12, when I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there is good feeling toward David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? In other words, if my father responds in a positive way, as you've already said, if he responds this way, then it's good. He says, well, will I not come and send for you? In other words, I think Jonathan says, I'll be excited about that. I'll be happy about that. It'll make me feel good. It'll take this weight off of my shoulders that I know is on your shoulders, David, but now is kind of on the shoulders of Jonathan as well, as David has kind of laid this on him here in this chapter. Verse 13, if it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety, and may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. So here's what he's saying. Okay, look, if my father has good feelings towards you based upon what you said, what you want me to do, and how he would react, will I not come and tell you? I will come and I'll tell you. I'll let you know, and you can come and be back, and everything will be good. He says, but he says that if I see by the response that my father gives that he wants to do you harm, okay, he says, may the Lord do to, and he uses his name in the third person here, but he's talking about himself here. May the Lord do to Jonathan or myself, and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away that you may go in safety. In other words, if I don't protect you from this, David, if I don't protect you from this, because I know that you've not done anything wrong. And so he's assuring David here of what he's going to do based upon the reaction of his father. If everything's good with my dad, I'll come and I'll send for you and I'll let you know, and I'll tell you the truth, I'll be honest, and everything will be good. But if I see that my father intends to do you harm, then, the Lord can get me if I don't do this, if I don't come tell you and send you away safely. In other words, get you out of harm's way. Get you somewhere where you're going to be safe, away from my father. Okay? So he's reassuring David that this is in fact what he's going to do, and he makes this vow, so to speak, before God. And so in verse 14, he says, if I'm still alive. Now notice how he goes a little bit further with this. If I am still alive, Will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? In other words, I think Jonathan is alluding here to the fact that he knows that at some point that David's going to be king. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe, because here's one thing that Jonathan has been able to see and realize. Because David is God's anointed, because David is the one that God has chosen to be king, God is going to protect David. And his enemies, whoever goes up against him, God is going to deal with them. Jonathan doesn't want to be seen as an enemy because of what his father does or has done or maybe perhaps will do. So you kind of get the picture that maybe Jonathan is starting to realize a little bit here that he might be right about my dad. You know, he might actually feel this way. He might actually be planning these things. And so at this point, Jonathan is asking David to show him kindness. Now, again, David just referred to himself as the servant of Jonathan. And now watch how Jonathan is turning it around, almost like saying, no, like, listen, will you show me kindness, right? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So he realizes, you know, my father could potentially be the enemy of David. And I know that the Lord is, and I think he knows this at this point, the Lord is not with my father any longer. He had to know that, right? Because one of the, the Bible talks about the Spirit of the Lord leaving Saul. And I don't think that was necessarily anything that Jonathan would have like seen a vapor come out of his mouth and float away or anything like that. But one of the telltale signs of all of that is, remember, after what Saul did with the Amalekites and all that, Samuel had been there for him the whole time, right? Telling him what God wanted him to do and all that. What does Samuel do after that? He leaves Saul, doesn't he? And he in other words, he says, the Lord's, he's done with you, so am I. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. That's what he does. So if nothing else, Jonathan would have seen that, and he would have known by seeing that, God's not with my father any longer. But he also knows that David is God's anointed. He knows that David's the next king. And he knows that because of God, that whoever David goes against, whoever his enemies are, those enemies are not going to be triumphant. So he's saying all this because he says, even when the Lord, and he doesn't say if, he says when the Lord, right, cuts off every one of the enemies of David from off the face of the earth. So Jonathan, verse 16, made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. No doubt about the relationship these two had, the friendship and the love that they shared between one another. And we know how that can be as well. Perhaps you have a friend that you're very, very close to that's really kind of like family to you. Maybe he's your best friend, somebody that you absolutely love and care for, that you'd do anything in the world for them. They'd do anything in the world for you. And that's the relationship these two had. And now David has reached at least in his young life, a critical point. Because Saul's angry with him. David realizes that. And he knows that his father's out to get him. And so he's relying upon Saul's son Jonathan, based upon their friendship, based upon their love, but based upon their mutual love, fear, and respect for God. They've made this covenant together that as he talks to him, and kind of they reassure all these things between one another. But he knows he has a trusted friend in Jonathan. And then now Jonathan at the end kind of turns it on David and says, look, will you show kindness to me and to my household? Because I know that one day, inevitably, you're going to be the king because that's what God has said. And I know that he's going to wipe out your enemies from in front of you, but show kindness to me and to my house. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead, but we know as we read forward in the story that eventually does happen. Okay? It eventually does happen. David holds true to that as far as Jonathan and his household is concerned. But, this particular set of Scripture, this particular lesson here, I think shows us some beautiful things about friendship, about the way we should be with one another, about even that when you have someone that has that mutual fear and love and respect for God, the kind of relationship you can have and that you can trust one another. Because think about this in the characteristics, and the book kind of points this out when it talks about friends in the very beginning, and it talks about some of the things that when you think about an ideal friend, someone who is kind and compassionate, someone who is loyal, but someone who is truthful with us, right? We talked about that already. And so that's what David and Jonathan had in each other. And David knew he could trust Jonathan to do this, to help him to be able to figure out what's going on and what David needs to do next in all of this. And now next week, when we get forward, next week we're going to look at more of this story. We'll still be, I think, in chapter 20 as we move forward and see what the reaction of his father is, what's going to happen. As Jonathan goes and he gets ready to go do what David has said to do, what's going to be the reaction here? What's going to happen? We're going to look at that next week as we come back together again. But hopefully a lesson that will help us, that will strengthen us and help us to be better people, better friends, more trusting in God, and choosing the right friends. That's the end of our class. Thank you for your attention, and we'll break for about 15 minutes, and we'll come back for our worship. Thank you.